at the forefront of change and development, a city comes with a life of comforts, opportunities, charms, and all the modern facilities a person could want. The spread of cities as a new age landform themselves has been a characteristic feature of every thriving economy. Tall buildings and bustling traffic are monuments to how sought after the urban lifestyle is and the rate at which a city's populace is expanding. The growth of cities drives modernization, local trade and commerce, and brings about radical improvements in the economic, political, and cultural makeup of the country. It sets a stage for the science, technology, and education sectors to evolve. As the human population increases, so does the pressure for urbanization. By 2050, it's expected that nearly 70% of the world's population will live in cities. Studies from recent times show a rapid flow of rural populations to urban areas, with the intention of improving quality of life, earning better wages, and access to varied resources.
So if you think about the origin of cities, cities began about 5,000 years ago. But it's not as if we had cities ubiquitously all over the world. In fact, until about 500 years ago, you had the bulk of the world's population living outside cities, outside what we call governments and kingdoms and so on. And so cities are nothing other than sort of agglomerations, dense settlements of people. Now that produces other important social effects, and that's why we admire cities today.
Around the world, metropolitan regions are haphazardly sprawling past their effective borders and into the suboptimal peri-urban areas. The planet seems to have entered the Peri-cene phase.
The definition of the peri-urban has always been sort of contested. Different people around the world, different scholars use different ways of thinking about the peri-urban. Some of them say, well, take the city and simply look at a certain distance outside the city, the fringe of the city, and then you can start to see city-like characteristics in that area. That's the peri-urban. But I think the best way to think about it is as a set of processes that are city-like, that are taking place beyond formal cities. So if you take administrative boundaries of cities, put a kind of a black tape over that, and then area at the fringes of that, which look like cities, are the peri-urban.
The Peri-cene phase is a new global human environment system shaped by peri-urbanization. While urbanization does have the benefit of generating new jobs, income, revenue to the government, and population diversity, the rapid spreading of cities into larger areas has revealed significant issues that arise due to peri-urbanization. Around the world, the peri-urban areas show global hubs and local enclaves, sprawl and disorder, disruption of communities and livelihoods, and in particular, growing climate risks and ecological disruption.
The word Peri-cene is a play on Anthropocene, and there what we're trying to say is peri-urbanization is one of the contributing factors to the Anthropocene, because it's urbanization, not just climate change, that's also changing the landscape. So we want to try and understand what are the different dynamics of peri-urbanization around the world, and different ecosystems, different economies, different regions of the world, for various reasons, have slightly different syndromes or characteristics of peri-urbanization. Recently, New York had a terrible storm, Ida, where 43 people in greater New York, in the greater city region of New York, including New Jersey and so on, died, mostly outside Manhattan. So that sort of tells you that it's important to sort of really look at what's happening in the periphery of these city regions when most of the resources aren't there to support people and so on. So adaptation to climate change is another very important reason to pay attention to the peri-urban.
The disasters of disorderly growth of cities and improper urban planning can best be seen in the Indian city of Chennai. Chennai is India's fourth largest metropolitan agglomeration with 9 million inhabitants. Founded in 1640 and a major center of the British Empire, its growth has been phenomenal only since around 1990. The rapid urbanization crisis in Chennai has implications of climate risk, socioeconomic divisions and disruptions, and suboptimal governance. From the beginning, the research of Indo-German Center for Sustainability in the metropolitan region of Chennai has focused on 3 critical areas: water, land use, and governance. All 3 areas interdependently connected to the process of peri-urbanization. Historically, Chennai's ecology in the hinterland area, such as Sriperumbudur, Muthukadu, and Ennore, has been its protection against cyclones, floods, drought, and rise in sea level in these areas, disasters that are inherent to the climatic landscape of a coastal city like Chennai.
About 7 years ago, in 2014, we had started asking questions about the periphery of Chennai. We had started to see Chennai's borders grow, especially this area called Sriperumbudur. That launched something called the Peri-urban Initiative. And we had a workshop in which one of the present partners of the Peri-cene project, Joe Ravitz, came and gave a lecture. And so we started developing this relationship and we applied for this grant together. So the Peri-cene project began by looking at 2 city regions, Manchester and Chennai city region. And we decided to think about common approaches to studying both. Now, Joe Ravitz and his team have been looking at the greatest area of around Manchester for more than a decade. So they had far more experience than we did. And but we pooled our resources together and started to think about how should we approach these areas outside.
However, with the growth of Chennai as an industrial hub in the past few decades, significant urbanization has drastically altered the complex landscape and water pathways, making it vulnerable to multiple climate risks. As the hinterlands urbanize and the borders of the city expand, a multitude of new problems arise.
If you go back historically, like Chennai's development, like we can talk about it prior to 1688. That's where the Britishers officially recognized Chennai as a corporation civic body organization. Before that, it was pretty like kind of the development you could see near the temple or the religious centers or even the coastal areas where you could be able to see the development. And there was a area system that was like specifically water bodies. We can talk about it was existed and it was a marvelous ancient engineering system. They prepared a master plan. They wanted to go for urbanization, but in terms of orderly developed, and that's what they started to have this kind of create a ribbon development. Though they targeted highway, along the highway they wanted to spread across.
Mostly we are dealing with the present risk, which is mostly the global environmental changes as well as the local risk. So floods, disasters, cyclones. So it is not about that you have a corporation as an administrator in the city and the state is there and Chennai is a capital city. If we see the adjacent areas, which would be technically controlled by, if there is a town, there will be a town panchayat. If there will be a village, then there will be a village level administration, which comes from the Constitution of India 73rd and 74th Amendment. The question here is that the GCC, Greater Chennai Corporation's limit is that the CMDA boundary, and the environmental aspects and the ecological aspects, or I would say the ecosphere aspect, doesn't obey this administrative boundaries.
Hence, to build a framework to understand peri-urban growth, it was necessary to analyze the different factors at play in each locality: water bodies, industries, infrastructure, ecology, and other stakeholders that enable the project to map the boundaries of the different zones of peri-urban areas.
Our peri-urban, the total region that we have defined, is based on the watershed concept. There you can see this is the water sector that matters here, because water is central to the city of Chennai and also to the peri-urban region, because in the peri-urban region, agriculture still plays a major role. But, and this is now the link to land, there's a lot of conversion of land use from agricultural and even ecosystem services that are being affected, for example, water bodies or forests that are being converted into development land. And of course, large-scale infrastructures, construction of highways, but also railway lines are being built. So this is where the transformation of the peri-urban becomes visible. And of course, if you have big industries, manufacturing industries, there is also a different demand on water as a resource. This is one connect between water and land.
So initially, when we're trying to dissect the peri-urban for the Chennai landscape, and basically Chennai's expansion has happened along these major highways. So the Chennai-Bangalore highway, the Chennai-Trichy highway, and the OMR and ECR. So the zones have been broadly developed across these corridors, but also paying attention to certain morphological, geographical aspects. And so we've broadly divided the region into the northern region, which is Ennore and Tiruvallur, and then the corridor towards the west, which is the industrial corridor. A lot of the SIPCOTs and the SEZs are located over here. And then towards the south, which is the IT corridor. And this was a concerted effort actually by the city to sort of, boost growth and development in the southern part of the city. The first zone that we looked at is in the northern part of Chennai, that's Ennore and Tiruvallur. And Ennore has been sort of the forgotten part of the city. There's a lot of heavy public infrastructure. There's the port of Chennai located over there. There are several thermal power plants, fertilizer factories, foundries, and so on. So the whole landscape is heavily, industrialized. You see smokestacks and chimneys, and hardly can support human habitation. And so it's this coming together of this very heavy engineering, base, and also these kupams, many of them whose livelihoods have actually come into question because they live in this now very ecologically degraded, fragile system. There are serious implications of what climate change could do for a place like Ennore, because there's sea level rise, there's storm surge. Even now, as we met with these fishermen in the Kupam, we see how even in the floods they were saved just by some rocks and barriers that have been built over there.
இதில் பிரச்சனைகள்னு சொல்லி பார்த்தோம்னா நிறைய பிரச்சனைகள் இருக்குது. ஒவ்வொரு நிமிஷமும் ஒவ்வொரு மீனவனும் இந்த கடலும் ஆறும் ஒன்றா சேர்ற அந்த ஷான்பார் மவுத் அந்த இடத்துல எல்லாமே இந்த போட்டு தொழில் பண்ண போகும்போது அலையினுடைய அதிர்வு தாங்க முடியாம போட்டு கவிழ்ந்து இந்த மாதிரியான கம்பெனிங்கெல்லாம் வந்து ஃபுல்லாக இந்த மணலும் டஸ்ட்டு அந்த சாம்பல் கழிவு எல்லாம் விட்டு இந்த ஆறே பால் படுத்தி பள்ளமே இல்லாமல் இறால் மீன் அழிவு, நண்டு அழிவு, மீன் அழிவு, இந்த மாதிரி அதிகபட்சம் இந்த ஃபேக்டரியும் இருக்கிற சுற்றுப்புற சூழ்நிலை வந்து எங்கள் மீனவர்களுடைய வாழ்வாதாரத்தையே அழிச்சு. ஸோ நாங்கள் என்ன சொல்றதே புரியல, சத்தியமா சொல்றேங்க, நிஜமா சொல்றோம். ஆனால் எல்லாம் நீட்டாக நடக்கிறோம், இருந்தாலும் உள்ளுக்குள்ள ஒவ்வொரு குடும்பத்திலையும் பசியும் பட்டு வேதனை.
In Sriperumbudur, a town about 40 kilometers from the city center of Chennai, we can see the impacts of peri-urbanization play out. Large-scale industrialization in this area has resulted in a significant alteration of its landscape, waterways, and the socio-economic structure of its community. As the land value, economy, and employment rate in Sriperumbudur skyrocketed, its impact was seen in the hamlet of Kachipattu, a formerly small-scale agrarian community with a modest population of 5,000. Kachipattu sits on the sidelines of Sriperumbudur in terms of both territories and urbanization. A neighborhood bypassed by globalization, this town hosts a large number of unemployed youth with technical diplomas.
The second zone is the Western Corridor, and it sort of broadly actually falls in between the Chennai-Bangalore highway and the Chennai-Trichy highway. These are major highways that are going outside of the city, and a lot of the development has taken place across these highways. But also there are these special economic zones that have been set up between Sriperumbudur and Oragadam. These are industrial hubs that were created with subsidies for industries to set up their manufacturing units, and many of them are focused around the automobile industry. There's auto parts, there's electricals, and so on. So it's not just the industries themselves. These were clusters that were set up. Of course, Sriperumbudur is about 40 kilometers from the city, so there's quite a distance between the city and these hubs itself. But along these highways, we now see gated communities, large apartments and residential units that have come up. In addition to that, because of the land availability in these areas, over the last 20 years, we've seen several engineering colleges mushrooming in these areas.
Alongside the issue of village panchayats of the region clashing with industries on matters such as water and land, Kachipattu has also experienced disservice in governance. With legislation and urban planning being in support of setting up SEZs, Kachipattu has lost large swaths of farmland to industries and informal settlements.
So Kachipattu is basically a Dalit hamlet which were traditionally landless laborers in the neighboring of Sriperumbudur. And a lot of them have fallen out of agriculture because these lands have been converted into real estate, or they have gone fallow because of the drying up of the nearby water bodies.
This village is really having a disadvantage factor in the sense the poverty, unemployment, risky behaviors among youth, early marriage, social stigmatization, so many aspects. So which in fact really affects the life of young people, and the young people become the reason for more risky behaviors in that community, and also for social tension. So Rajiv Gandhi National Institute of Youth Development is working in that Kachipattu village since 2016. So primarily we have been providing awareness cum sensitization programs on various themes. Even entrepreneurship, personality development, and even alcoholism and risky behaviors.
The landscape between Mutukadu on the coast and Siriseri in the hinterlands, roughly about 200 square kilometers large, is a highly fragmented area, both in terms of ecology and community. This area, between two major highways, forms the southern corridor and has recently seen rapid urban development encroaching upon water bodies that drain into the Buckingham Canal.
So in Muthukadu, we were trying to understand how the various landscapes and the communities that live in it interact with each other. And we found that the best way to do this would be taking the Transect approach. And so what we do essentially is we cut out a 20 kilometer by 10 kilometer bit starting from the coast up into the hinterlands. And we kind of use this natural morphology to study the people and the interactions that happen between them. So this entire complex waterscape today is kind of fragmented by man-made small micro ecosystems. You have the Pudupakam area around which the traditional tribal communities called the Irulars that live there, and they're generally surface fishermen but also used to work in the Savaku trees, the farming of these trees, and also there was a lot of agriculture that was going on around that belt, so they were traditionally involved in agriculture there. But later when the Sipcot came up, they became also land like laborers there, and domestic help and all of this. Yes, they did get some employment, but the entire colony is under risk of overflooding because the Sipcot sit right on the drainage channels, and when there is a lot of rain, the flood water that is supposed to seamlessly drain into the Buckingham Canal kind of gets blocked. The water just then overflows into the Irular colonies, and their housing currently gets damaged.
ஸோ இந்த நிலைமையில் நாங்கள் இருக்கும்போது இப்போ வந்து கிட்டத்தட்ட இந்த 17 வருஷத்தில் நாங்கள் அனுபவிக்கிற இல்லல்கள் எப்படின்னு பார்த்தீங்கன்னாக்கா, ஒரு 5-6 வருஷமாக பார்த்தீங்கன்னாக்கா இந்த பக்கத்தில் இருக்க வந்து முட்டுக்காடு முகத்துவாரத்தில் வந்து பார்த்தீங்கன்னாக்கா 2005 வந்து சிக்டா இந்த ரெயின் டைம் வந்து சென்னை ஃபுல்லாக முழுங்கிடுச்சு. அப்போ வந்து முழுங்கின காரணத்தினால முகத்துவாரத்தை வந்து விரிவுபடுத்தணும்னு சொல்லிட்டு கவர்மெண்ட் வந்து என்ன பண்ணுறாங்கன்னா, பாறை கற்கள் கொட்டி முகத்துவாரத்தை வந்து அகலமாக ஓடணும்னு சொல்லிட்டு கொட்டினாங்க. அந்த கற்கள் வந்து கிட்டத்தட்ட ஒரு 200 மீட்டர் கொட்டும் போது அந்த கல் கொட்டின பாதிப்பு வந்து பார்த்திங்கன்னா எங்கள் மீனவ பகுதி பக்கத்தில் இருக்கோம், நாங்கள் அந்த பக்கம் இருக்க கோவளம் குப்பை 2 குப்பத்துக்கும் பாதிப்பு வந்து வருது. 2019 வந்து ஏடிஎம் ஆட்சியில் வந்து எங்களுக்கு வந்து இந்த தூண்டில் அளவு வந்து சக்ஸஸ் ஆகிருக்கு. தூண்டில் அளவு இப்போ மோத்தவரத்தில் எப்படி கல் கொட்டினாங்களோ அதே தூண்டில் அளவு எங்களுக்கு கொட்டி கொடுத்தாதான் எங்களோட மீனவ பகுதியை வந்து காப்பாற்ற முடியும். ஏன்னா இன்றைக்கி படகு நிப்பாட்டுறதுக்கு இடம் கிடையாது. கிட்டத்தட்ட ஒரு 20 மீட்டர் டிஸ்டன்ஸில் தான் வந்து கடலும் ஆறும் இருக்குது. நாங்கள் வந்து பார்த்திங்கன்னா ஆற்றை தாண்டி தான் தொழில் பண்ண வரோம். கடல் பக்கத்தில் ஆறுக்கு அப்புறமா தான் எங்களோட வில்லேஜ் இருக்குது. வில்லேஜ்லேருந்து நாங்கள் வரணுனாலே ஒரு ஆற்றை தாண்டி வரணும். அந்த ஆற்றை தாண்டி வரது கூட கவர்மெண்ட் வந்து எங்களுக்கு தற்காலிக பாதை ரோடு எதுவுமே அமைச்சு தரல.
We have been looking at 3 particular areas within the peri-urban research questions that we posed. And one is the question of water. The other one is the question of land. And the third one is the question of governance.
Peri-urban areas present a particular challenge to climate governance. But surprisingly, this is also a place where we're finding adaptive governance is emerging. So peri-urban areas are usually undergoverned areas. They're kind of leftover places. They're at the frontier of urbanization. So the various government procedures, the various bureaucratic structures are not really in place in peri-urban areas. So this provides opportunities for innovation. This provides opportunities for creative thinking, for bringing together some different stakeholders. So ultimately, the idea of adaptive governance is really about creating these sustainable urban transformations. So it's really going beyond sort of these transitions, kind of incremental improvements to society, to the environment, to economics, and really thinking about how can we make a step change? How can we make a significant change in the way that we experience the world today? one of the primary benefits of adaptive governance is this idea of collaboration. And collaboration takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of coordination and a good bit of funding. But when you do it right, you can realize synergies between different stakeholder groups, or we might call them co-benefits. So this is when you can find agricultural stakeholders that can come together with tourist stakeholders, that can come together with local economy stakeholders, that can come together with climate stakeholders, and they can find different co-benefits or a nexus between their different aims and objectives.
Well, the synergistics, it's a long word for something which is really very simple. And that is, how do people communicate? How do people learn about new things and new possibilities? And how do they learn to cooperate? The possible synergies between land use, jobs, education, housing, transport, energy production, climate change, the peri-urban situation where the forces of urban development are pushing into the countryside, the rural areas, and again, turning them upside down in many ways. We could all do this better, whether we're in UK or in India. So we're looking for the common features. What are the bridges that can be built where one place can maybe even learn from what is possible in another place? So that's the basic idea on which this project is working.
The Peri-cene project analyzes the peri-urban areas under different perspectives to understand their socioeconomic, political, ecological, and cultural dynamics. The aim is to develop novice solutions, termed adaptive pathways, to respond to the unique challenges facing these regions. The study explores the synergistic model of collaborated efforts by different stakeholders to establish transformational solutions such as adaptive governance, agroecology, water management, and ecotourism.
One of the pathways we were envisaging for building sustainable cities has been an agroecological pathway to achieve food sovereignty and also maintain the ecological integrity of the city's waterscapes. Actually, when coming to how the food consumption of Chennai was traced, we kind of looked at consumption patterns in Chennai. And most of the food that is consumed in Chennai came from more than 200 kilometers away. So that's a lot of trucks bringing in food into Chennai, which is like burning a lot of diesel basically. And if we were to basically grow this entire food in the basin, we would be able to cut down on so much of carbon miles. So it's not just about carbon miles, but when you have disaster that strikes the city should be able to self-sustain itself or feed itself. And that is a very important feature in building resilient cities or building resilience around cities. So building food sovereign cities would also include reimagining the current socio-economic models and the current supply chain networks. It would mean we are shortening them. It would mean that we are becoming more inclusive in including a lot of other stakeholders. And through the model that we are proposing, we intend to create and use the farmer-producer organization systems where these landless laborers become equal stakeholders in the venture, and they have a decision-making voice in what they adopt and what they actually grow on their lands. We believe that we can use zero budget natural farming and other regenerative forms of agroecology to actually bring back the water and the waterscapes, and also use climate resilient agricultural techniques so they do not have to need a lot of water and a lot of inputs to grow and do subsistence farming on their so-called wastelands, because no land is actually waste, and you can still bring back some form of ecological integrity back to the land, and these lands can become green again.
agroecology might be one of the ways in which we could, transition or create spaces that are ecologically more resilient in the periphery. The similar type of transition pathway one could think about in Muthukadu, for example, is to think about ecotourism, for example. Given that there are fishing, villages, there have been, threats to their livelihoods with sea level rise. So could we think about, complementing or think about additional or alternative livelihood opportunities for these, not just the fishing community over there, but it would also mean bringing together other people who live in that region. So these policy labs, we've been, interacting with different stakeholders. A lot of it has been online, of course, but it is exactly to come up with these kinds of, think about different ideas, but also the governance models that we can tap into across the three scales.
For Chennai, we're hoping in multiple ways. So it's a piece of research, and so we want to try and understand some of these dynamics. So we want to try and build connections at multiple scales, at the landscape scale, at the community scale, and the regional, larger bioregional scale. So the building connections across scales is important from a conceptual perspective.
So we can identify a number of these very specific pathways, which can be then spelled out more in detail, and potentially we can also develop policies out of this. So the idea is to move from a future vision of a pathway towards action through policies and then also development plans, ideally.
We are very hopeful that we have to begin by looking at such collaborative efforts. We have to use multiple methods to try and understand these complex transformations. And we feel that that's going to lead to approaches of governance, adaptive governance, that are going to be absolutely essential in order to be responsive to